They dragged her out of first class in front of everyone. A tired woman in plain clothes, a worn military dog at her side, and a first-class ticket in her hand that nobody believed was real. Passengers laughed. A flight attendant apologized to the other passengers, not to her. A man in a tailored suit said, loudly enough for 3 rows to hear, that some people simply didn't know their place. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She picked up her bag, touched the dog's head once, and walked toward the back of the plane. What nobody in that cabin knew, what nobody had known for 9 years, was that the woman they just humiliated had carried wounded soldiers out of enemy territory on her back. And the dog walking beside her? He remembered every second of it. If this story already has you gripped, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, follow along so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Nora Voss almost missed her flight, she was still pulling a double shift. She had worked 41 hours out of the last 48, covering for a colleague who'd called out sick, then staying voluntarily because the ICU at Callaway Ridge Medical Center was 3 nurses short and the charge nurse looked like she was about to cry. Nora didn't like seeing people cry when she could do something about it. That was perhaps the most honest thing anyone could have said about her. She stayed when it was easier to leave. She had always done that. Some people called it dedication. Her ex-boyfriend called it an inability to let herself rest. He wasn't entirely wrong. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room at 6:40 in the morning, shoved her hospital badge into her bag without looking at it, and pulled on a pair of dark jeans and a gray long-sleeve shirt that had seen better days. She hadn't packed carefully. There hadn't been time. The duffel bag she carried was military surplus, the kind with reinforced handles and a zipper that had been repaired once with electrical tape. It looked like it belonged to someone who had once cared deeply about utility and had never quite switched to caring about appearances. The drive to Mercer Regional Airport took 22 minutes. She made it in 18. At the check-in desk, the agent looked at her ticket, looked at her, and then looked at the dog. Titan was a Belgian Malinois, nearly 9 years old, with a graying muzzle and a scar along his left flank that disappeared under his coat. He sat perfectly still at Nora's left heel, not pulling at his leash, not sniffing the strangers moving past. He just watched. His eyes tracked the room with the kind of precision that didn't belong to a pet. "He's a certified service animal," Nora said, before the agent could ask. She slid the documentation across the counter. "All paperwork's there, health clearance, temperament certification, transport authorization." The agent flipped through it. Her expression was neutral in the way that meant she was deciding something. "First class?" "That's what it says." "Okay." She printed the boarding passes without further comment, though her eyes moved to Titan one more time. "Enjoy your flight." Nora took the passes and walked toward security, one hand resting briefly on Titan's head. He leaned into it for a half second, just enough to feel, and then they were moving again. She had not planned to be traveling at all this week. The call had come 4 days ago, from a woman named Lorraine Whitfield, who spoke in the carefully measured voice of someone who had been managing grief for a long time and had gotten dangerously good at it. Lorraine was the mother of Marcus Whitfield, a soldier who had died 6 years ago during an operation in a mountainous corridor Nora was not legally permitted to name, in a country she was not currently permitted to confirm she had been in. Marcus had been a dog handler. Titan had been his dog. When Marcus died, Titan had been airlifted out with 2 broken ribs and a shrapnel wound to his flank. He had survived. He had been placed in a military working dog retirement program in the 4 years since, cycling through 3 different foster situations, each one ending with the same assessment: animal shows, persistent anxiety, difficulty bonding, not recommended for general civilian placement. Nobody had been able to explain it. Titan had been healthy. He was responsive to commands, showed no aggression, passed every behavioral evaluation. He just wouldn't settle. He would lie at the edge of whatever room he was in, facing the door, and wait. What he was waiting for, nobody knew. Nora had learned about Titan's situation through a friend from her service years, someone who still worked in military animal program administration and occasionally passed along updates she knew Nora would want. The message had been brief. Titan's been placed again, 3rd time. They think he'll wash out of the program. She had read it 3 times, standing in the break room at Callaway Ridge, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She hadn't responded immediately. She had stood there for a while thinking about things she spent most of her daily life not thinking about, and then she had gone back to work. But that night, she had called the program, and after 2 days of paperwork and phone calls and one very uncomfortable conversation with a records office that wanted to confirm her identity 6 different ways, she had been authorized to transport Titan from the military animal facility in Fort Garner, Texas to Hadley City, where a ceremony was being held to formally retire him with honors. His records, his handler's commendation, a proper end to the service he had given. Lorraine Whitfield had asked if Nora would bring him. She hadn't explained why. She'd just asked, in that quiet, measured voice, and Nora had said yes before she fully thought it through. That was how she ended up on this particular flight, with a military dog and a first-class ticket she hadn't paid for. Lorraine had arranged it, insisting, and 37 minutes of sleep in the last 2 days. The boarding gate was crowded. The flight to Hadley City was full, and there was that particular tension that descended on boarding areas when people were already tired and the day hadn't started. Nora found a seat at the edge of a row, let Titan settle at her feet, and closed her eyes for exactly 11 minutes before the boarding announcement came. She didn't notice the couple until she was already in her seat. They were in the row across the aisle, a man in a jacket that probably cost more than Nora's monthly rent, and a woman whose carry-on luggage matched in a way that required advanced planning. They were the kind of people who traveled first class regularly enough that they had opinions about who else should be there. The man had already flagged down a flight attendant twice before takeoff to confirm that his upgrade had been processed correctly. He noticed Titan when Nora sat down. "Is that a dog?" "Yes," Nora said. "In first class?" "We're both in first class, yes." He looked at his wife. She looked at him. Some entire conversation happened between them in that glance, the kind built on years of shared judgment. "I'm not sure that's appropriate," the woman said to the flight attendant who was passing through, rather than to Nora. "I have allergies." The flight attendant, a young woman with a practiced smile, looked genuinely uncertain. "Ma'am, service animals are permitted in the cabin." "He's enormous," the man said. "And she doesn't look—" He paused. His eyes moved over Nora. The worn shirt, the surplus duffel, the lack of anything that read as belonging here. "She doesn't look like she's supposed to be up here." Nora was tired. Deep down, cellular tired. She had 17 separate emotional responses available to her, and she chose none of them. She looked at the man and said, "My ticket is the same as yours." "That's not the point." "Then I'm not sure what the point is." A second flight attendant appeared, and then a third. There was a murmured conversation in the aisle that Nora could hear perfectly well because nobody was making any real effort to lower their voices. The words disruption and comfort of other passengers, and perhaps just for the flight, were all used in various combinations. In the window seat of Nora's row, a man in his late 50s had been watching this exchange without expression. He was wearing civilian clothes, khaki slacks, a plain dark shirt, but there was something about the way he sat that didn't quite fit the setting. The stillness, maybe, or the way his eyes moved. He had glanced at Titan twice since they'd boarded, both times with an expression Nora couldn't read. She wasn't paying attention to him. She was watching the lead flight attendant approach. "Miss Voss," the attendant said quietly, "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. Would you be willing to move to a seat in premium economy? We'll, of course." "My documentation is in order," Nora said. "I understand, and we absolutely—" "Is there a policy violation?" The attendant hesitated. "No, ma'am, but then I'd like to know the specific reason I'm being asked to move." The man across the aisle leaned slightly forward. "The reason is that people paid a lot of money for this cabin, and not everyone wants to sit next to a—" "I paid for this ticket," Nora said. She said it quietly, without heat. "The same as you." The man's face changed. Not anger exactly, something closer to the specific irritation of someone who was used to getting their way quickly and was encountering unexpected friction. His wife touched his arm. He shook her off. "This is ridiculous. We've paid for this experience." "Sir." The flight attendant had shifted into a different register. Still professional, but firmer. "I'm going to ask you to lower your voice." There were 3 other passengers in first class watching openly now. One woman in the back row had stopped pretending to look at her phone. An older man by the window had his arms crossed, but the attendant still turned back to Nora, still with the apologetic tilt of the head, still with the "I'm sorry, but." "Ms. Voss, I want to handle this as smoothly as possible. If you'd be comfortable in premium economy, we can ensure Titan has additional space, and we'll make sure you're—" Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Titan. He was watching her, not the attendant, not the man across the aisle, just her. His ears were forward and his tail was still, and he was simply waiting to see what she would decide. She thought about being 26 years old and carrying a man out of a burning structure in the dark, with 2 of her own ribs cracked, because no one else was close enough and someone had to. She thought about the 9 years she had done things that would not appear on any public record, in places that did not appear on her civilian file, for people who had never said her name out loud in any official context. She thought about how tired she was. "Titan," she said. "Up." He stood immediately. She reached up and pulled her duffel from the overhead bin, settled the strap on her shoulder, and walked toward the back of the plane. She didn't look at the couple as she passed. She didn't look at anyone. She found the 2 seats that had been hastily cleared for her in the last row of premium economy, sat down, pushed her bag under the seat in front of her, and let Titan settle across her feet. Her jaw was tight. She made herself unclench it. A flight attendant appeared almost immediately with a drink she hadn't ordered, sparkling water, and an apology that was technically an apology but didn't quite reach one in practice. Nora thanked her and looked out the window. The plane began to pull back from the gate. Nora had learned over a long career of situations that required her to stay functional in conditions she did not choose, how to manage the particular combination of humiliation and exhaustion that followed being publicly dismissed. You breathed through it. You let the body's response run its chemical course without feeding it with more attention. You did not replay the scene. You did not imagine what you should have said. You just sat in it until it passed, the way you sat in bad weather. She was 2 minutes into this practice when Titan made a sound. Not a bark, not a whine. A very low, sustained sound that she had heard exactly 3 times in her life, and each of those 3 times it had preceded something going wrong. She sat forward. He was on his feet, which she hadn't seen him do unassisted in weeks. His head was raised, his nose was working. His entire body had shifted into the posture she recognized, the one that meant he was not reacting to the environment, but to something inside a person nearby. He had been trained for explosive detection, and then secondarily, during Marcus's tenure, for medical alert. Nobody had certified him for the latter because nobody had formally tested it, but Nora had seen what he could find. She followed his line of attention. 3 rows ahead, a man in his 60s was sitting with one hand pressed flat against his chest and the other gripping the armrest. His face had the particular grayish pallor that she associated with the 4 seconds before someone's body announced it was in serious trouble. He wasn't clutching, not dramatically. He just had that look of someone trying to hold very still, as though movement might confirm something he wasn't ready to confirm. Nora was already moving. She reached him in 4 steps, crouched down to his eye level, and said quietly, "Sir, I'm a nurse. Can you tell me where you're feeling that pressure?" He looked at her. His eyes were slightly unfocused. It's probably nothing." "Okay, let's figure that out together. Can you rate the pressure for me? 1 to 10. He swallowed. 7, maybe 8. "Is it spreading anywhere? Down your arm? Up your jaw?" He hesitated. She watched his face. "A little," he said. "Left arm." "Okay." She turned to the nearest flight attendant who had appeared at the edge of her vision. "I need the onboard medical kit. Right now. And I need you to contact the captain. He may need to assess whether we're diverting." The attendant blinked. "Are you a nurse? Go." The attendant went. Nora turned back to the man. His name, she would learn in the next 30 seconds, was Harold Beam. He was 67, a retired civil engineer traveling alone to visit his daughter who had just had her first child. He was terrified. She could see that, though he was trying very hard to look like he wasn't. "Harold," she said, "I've got you. Just stay with me." He nodded. His hand was still pressed against his sternum. The medical kit arrived. Nora opened it on the tray table and ran through the contents in under 10 seconds, categorizing what was there and what wasn't. Oxygen, aspirin, a basic AED tucked in the overhead compartment, which the attendant confirmed. No nitrates. "Are you on any blood thinners?" she asked Harold. "No." "Any aspirin allergies?" "No." "Okay." She found the aspirin in the kit, broke one and pressed it into his hand. "Chew that. Don't swallow it whole. And I need you to tell me immediately if the pressure gets worse." He put it in his mouth. His eyes were on her. Not panicked, locked in. Like he'd made a decision to trust her and had committed to it fully. In the row behind Harold, a man with silver hair and very straight posture had stood up without drawing attention to himself. He didn't announce himself or try to intervene. He just positioned himself close enough to be useful if needed, and he watched Nora work with an expression she wasn't looking at, because she wasn't looking at anything except Harold. She checked Harold's pulse at his wrist. Elevated, irregular. She kept her face neutral. "You're doing great," she said, and she meant it practically. His breathing had steadied, which mattered. From the front of the cabin, she could hear the lead flight attendant talking to the captain on the intercom. The plane's altitude had not changed, which meant they were gathering information before deciding. "Good." "Is there a doctor on board?" the attendant called out, raising her voice over the ambient noise. Nobody answered. 3 passengers were watching Nora now from the seats around Harold. One woman had her hand over her mouth. The man with the tailored jacket, Nora noticed this without particularly caring, had appeared at the edge of the premium economy section, craning his neck to see what was happening. Titan sat at Nora's left knee. Still. Patient. His alert had done its job. She kept her focus on Harold's face and her fingers on his wrist, and the steady rhythm she was maintaining in her own breathing, because sometimes the most useful thing you could offer a frightened person was evidence that the person taking care of them was not frightened at all. "Harold," she said, when she felt his pulse shift slightly. "Talk to me. What's your daughter's name?" He blinked. "What?" "Your daughter, the one you're going to meet. What's her name?" He was quiet for a half second, and then something in his face changed. Not relief, but something adjacent to it. "Greta?" he said. "She just named the baby, actually. Mara." "That's a beautiful name," Nora said. She meant that too. She checked his pupils. She watched the color in his face. She stayed. The man with silver hair, still standing, still watching, had lowered himself back into his seat when it became clear that Nora had the situation stable. He didn't speak. He reached into the front pocket of his bag and found something he held loosely in one hand, looking at it with an expression that might have been recognition. In the overhead light, you could see it clearly if you were close enough. It was a military identification tag, not his own. Older, worn smooth at the edges. The chain had been replaced more than once. He turned it over once, then looked at the graying Malinois at the nurse's knee, and the expression on his face became very still. The name on the tag, pressed into the metal in the way they used to do it before the format changed, read K9 Titan. First handler, Whitfield M. The man closed his hand around it and didn't move for a long time. Up front, the intercom crackled. The captain had made a decision. And it was not to divert. The announcement came through the intercom in the measured, deliberately calm cadence that pilots used when they wanted to convey control of a situation they were still assessing. They were monitoring a medical situation on board. A medical professional was present and managing the patient. They would continue to Hadley City unless conditions changed. Flight time remaining, 1 hour 40 minutes. Nora heard it and didn't react outwardly. Inside, she was running the calculation she'd been running since she first crouched next to Harold. Whether he was stable enough to wait, whether the aspirin had done what it needed to do, whether the slight easing in his grip on the armrest meant the pressure was genuinely reducing, or whether he was just getting used to it, which was different and worse. "Harold, that pressure, is it the same, less, or more than 5 minutes ago?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He wasn't the type to say fine just to avoid inconvenience. "Less," he said. "Maybe a 6 now." Good. Keep breathing slow, like you're trying not to wake someone up. He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. She kept her hand at his wrist, not because she needed to count his pulse every 30 seconds. She had a reasonable picture of where he was, but because she had learned a long time ago that physical contact was its own kind of medicine. It told people they weren't alone in their body's emergency. That mattered more than most people gave it credit for. The flight attendant who had brought the kit, a young woman named Petra, according to her name tag, had positioned herself 2 rows back, close enough to respond if Nora called for something and far enough to not crowd the space. She was handling this well, Nora thought. Better than some medical professionals she'd worked beside. "Is there anyone you want me to call?" Petra asked quietly. "We have a satellite connection." Harold opened his mouth, then closed it. His daughter was about to have people over. She had a 3-week-old baby. He didn't want to land in Hadley City as a crisis. "Not yet," he said. Nora didn't push it. That was his call to make. Behind her, she was aware, without looking, of the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. It had the quality of a room after a loud noise, when everyone has gone still and is reassessing. The passengers who had been irritated about boarding delays or seat assignments or legroom had recalibrated. Something real was happening. That tended to quiet the small complaints. She heard movement in the aisle. Unhurried, but deliberate. The man with silver hair stopped at the edge of Harold's row and looked at Nora. Up close, he was older than she'd initially placed him. Early 60s at least, with the kind of face that had been weathered by sustained outdoor exposure rather than age alone. He moved without waste. She had been around enough people who carried military bearing that she recognized it even when they weren't in uniform. "Is there something I can do?" he asked. His voice was quiet and direct, not the voice of someone trying to be helpful in a performing way, the voice of someone who had asked that question in contexts where the answer was sometimes, "Yes, pull that cord," or "Yes, put pressure here." Nora assessed him in about 2 seconds. Can you sit on his other side and keep him talking? Don't let him fixate on the symptoms. Ask him things. The man moved into the seat without a word of acknowledgement, which was exactly right, and within 30 seconds he had Harold describing the structural challenges of a bridge project he'd worked on in 1994. Harold's voice, which had been tight and shallow, opened slightly. People talked differently when they were talking about things they knew well. Nora sat back 1 inch, not stepping away, just allowing herself a fraction of space, and let herself check on Titan. He had moved from her left knee to a position slightly behind and between the 2 seats, which put him within Harold's peripheral vision. His head was lowered, not the alert posture from before, something softer. She had seen him do this before too, and she had never quite been able to explain it to anyone who asked, because it sounded like projection. But she had seen it work. Animals in acute distress often responded to a calm, steady animal presence in ways that defied the clinical explanation. Harold glanced at Titan at one point, and his shoulders dropped a half inch. "He's a good dog," Harold said. "He's exceptional," Nora said. The silver-haired man glanced at Titan too, then at the worn ID tag visible just above Titan's collar, where Nora had resecured it before boarding. Something moved through his expression that he didn't share. 40 minutes passed. Harold's color improved. His pulse settled into something that was irregular but not alarmingly so, the rhythm of a heart that had been stressed and was recalibrating rather than failing. Nora updated Petra twice. Petra relayed the information to the captain. The captain relayed it to the ground team that would be waiting at Hadley City's gate, standard protocol once a medical situation had been flagged. When Harold's pressure reading had been stable for 20 minutes, and he had finished describing 3 different engineering projects, and was now telling the silver-haired man about a fishing trip in Montana that had gone wrong in 3 separate ways, Nora allowed herself to drink some of the water she'd been ignoring for an hour. Her hands were fine. They were steady when they needed to be. They always had been. That wasn't something she had ever struggled with, the steadiness in a crisis. What she sometimes struggled with was everything after. "You've done this before," Harold said. Not a question. "I've done variations of it," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating look of someone who had spent a career assessing whether structures would hold. "Not just nursing," he said. She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. The silver-haired man was watching her with the same quality of attention he'd been directing at Titan. Not intrusive, not performing interest, just watching with the patience of someone who had already formed a conclusion and was waiting to see if new information changed it. "What's your name?" Harold asked. "Nora?" "Nora." He nodded, like he was filing it somewhere useful. "My daughter's going to hear about you." "Tell her congratulations on Mara," Nora said. He smiled then, a real one. She stood and stretched, slowly, in the way of someone managing a lower back that had been crouched over a tray table for 40 minutes. Titan rose with her, automatically, and she pressed her hand briefly to the top of his head. "I'm going to check back in 10 minutes, she told Harold. "If anything changes before then, I'll tell her," the silver-haired man said. Nora nodded and moved back toward her seat. She had been in the aisle for about 4 steps when the silver-haired man said, quietly behind her, "Titan." She stopped. She hadn't introduced the dog. She hadn't said his name since boarding. She'd used he and him when speaking about him, the way people did with animals they were close to and didn't feel the need to announce. His name was on his tag, technically, but the tag was small and not visible from a distance. She turned. The silver-haired man was looking at her steadily. The ID tag he'd been holding earlier was still in his hand. She could see the chain now, draped between his fingers. He held it in a way that meant he'd been carrying it for a long time and knew exactly how its weight felt. "You know his name," she said. "I know more than his name," he said. "My name is Garrett Osman. I was Marcus Whitfield's commanding officer." The cabin noise didn't change. The engine hum continued at the same frequency it had for the last 2 hours. 2 rows ahead, Harold was still talking about Montana. Nothing outwardly shifted, but something shifted for Nora. She looked at Garrett Osman, at the ID tag, at the steadiness in his face, and said nothing for a moment, which she almost never did. She was generally a person who filled silences efficiently. "How long have you been looking at him?" she asked, meaning Titan. "Since we boarded." He paused. "I've been looking for you longer." She had been standing still in the aisle of a commercial flight, which was not a position she would have chosen for this conversation. She was aware of that. She moved back to the row and stood at the end of it, not sitting, not leaving. "Define looking," she said. Garrett turned the ID tag once in his hand. "After Marcus died, there was a report. An incomplete one, because the situation was classified, and the people involved were classified, and the after-action summary had 11 redactions in 14 pages. He said this without bitterness, the flat recitation of someone who had been frustrated by those redactions for a long time and had moved past the frustration into something more settled. One of the things that wasn't redacted was that a medic without a designation kept Titan alive for 4 hours before the extraction team arrived, used a field kit and whatever else was on hand. Nobody got her name in writing because she had already been pulled to a different location by the time the report was filed. Nora didn't move. "Titan's been through 3 placement situations," Garrett continued. "Each one he left. Wouldn't stay. The handlers are good people, so it wasn't their fault." He looked at the Malinois, who was looking back at him with the measured attention of an animal that was choosing how much energy to spend on a person. "I've known dogs to grieve. I've known them to search. I didn't know what he was doing until I saw him see you at the gate." Nora thought about the gate. She had arrived at the last minute. No time for the gradual approach that she'd planned, where she could let Titan smell the area and settle before they moved into the crowded terminal. She had come through the entrance fast, badge in hand, and Titan had been standing at the edge of the holding area with his handler from the transport program. He had turned toward her before she'd said a word, before she'd been close enough to be reasonably smelled over the terminal crowd. He had simply turned, and his tail had moved. Not the frantic movement of a dog greeting a stranger, but something slower, like remembering. She had thought at the time that she was projecting. "I wasn't his handler," she said. Her voice came out even. She had a lot of practice keeping her voice even. "I was a medic who was in the wrong place at the right time." That's one way to describe it. Garrett looked at her directly. The military has another description. There's a designation in his file, in the version of his file that exists at classification level 4, that says K9 Titan's survival in the field was attributable to a combat medic acting outside her assigned position with no authorization under direct fire for approximately 4 hours and 11 minutes. Nora was quiet. They never closed the record on who that was, Garrett said. The intercom crackled. 30 minutes to landing. Flight attendants should prepare the cabin. Nora looked at the ID tag in Garrett's hand. The chain was worn at a specific point, the place where a thumb would pass over it repeatedly, the way people handled things they thought about too often. "Why do you have that?" she asked. "Marcus gave it to me before the last deployment," Garrett said. "He said if anything happened to him, he wanted someone to make sure Titan was okay." A pause. "I haven't been able to do that. Not fully. Not until now." She stood in the aisle for another moment. "I'm just transporting him," she said, "to the retirement ceremony. That's all this is." Garrett didn't say anything. He looked at Titan, who had, at some point in the last 30 seconds, moved 2 feet closer to Nora without her noticing and was now sitting with his shoulder against her leg. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. She exhaled slowly through her nose and went back to her seat. The descent into Hadley City took 28 minutes, and Nora spent most of it looking out the window at a cloud cover that was thick enough to turn the city below into a suggestion. She was trying to put things in their correct order, the way she had been trained to do when a situation introduced too many variables at once. Field triage wasn't only for bodies. It applied to information too. What was critical? What was stable? What could wait? Garrett Osmond's presence on this flight was either a coincidence or it wasn't. She didn't have enough information to determine which, and she was aware that her instinct toward suspicion was sometimes a liability. Not everything was an operation. Some things were just what they appeared to be. What she was less able to dismiss was the part about the record, the designation in the file. She had spent 6 years not thinking about that mission, or rather, spending significant energy redirecting her thoughts whenever they moved toward it. She had applied for the nursing position at Callaway Ridge Medical Center 8 weeks after leaving service, given herself a new ordinary life with ordinary hours and ordinary problems, and found that the ordinary problems were exhausting in a completely different way than the other kind. But that was manageable. Ordinary exhaustion didn't follow you into your sleep. She had not planned to be found. Titan shifted his weight against her ankle, and she looked at him again. The gray around his muzzle, the scar along his ribs that matched a scar on her left forearm, the way he held himself even in a pressurized cabin at 30,000 feet with the same deliberate calm that she recognized because she had taught herself the same thing in different circumstances for different reasons. "You remembered," she said quietly. Not a question, not really directed at him, just something she needed to say out loud to make it real. His ear rotated toward her voice. The wheels touched down hard, and everyone grabbed their armrests, and Harold, 2 rows up, made a sound that was either relief or discomfort, and probably both. Nora was already half standing, checking on him before the plane had finished decelerating, and Petra appeared at the same moment with the same instinct. "How are you doing?" Nora asked Harold. "Alive," he said. "Which is a better answer than I thought I'd have an hour ago. Do you want me to stay with you until the medical team boards?" He nodded. His gratitude was the undemonstrative kind. A nod, a steadiness in his eyes that said, "I know what you did and I won't forget it." She appreciated that more than any of the other kinds. The plane taxied to the gate. Nora stayed with Harold. Garrett Osmond stood in the aisle 2 rows back, not interfering, not leaving. Titan sat between them both. When the door opened, the medical team came on fast. 2 EMTs with a gurney and a third person in a suit who was clearly hospital administration preparing for liability paperwork. They moved efficiently. Nora gave her report standing up, speaking in the clipped shorthand of someone who had given 100 field reports, and the lead EMT nodded without asking her to repeat anything, which told her he recognized the register. Harold caught her wrist as they prepared to transfer him. "Nora," he said. "I'll tell Lorraine you said hello," she said, even though she didn't know why she said it, because Harold didn't know Lorraine. But Harold smiled anyway, as if the sentiment translated regardless. "You're good at this," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She had no reasonable response to that, so she just squeezed his hand once and let the EMTs do their job. The passengers were filing out. The couple from first class had appeared in the aisle, the man in the expensive jacket and his wife with the matched luggage, and they were moving toward the exit without making eye contact with anyone in the premium economy section. The man had the rigid posture of someone who was aware they had behaved badly and had decided that the best response was velocity. He made it almost to the door. "Mr. Kellard!" The voice was Garrett's. The man, Kellard, stopped, turned slowly. Garrett was standing in the aisle with the same unremarkable stillness he'd had for the entire flight, one hand in his pocket, the other at his side. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't performing anything. "I didn't catch your name earlier," Garrett said, "but I got it from the attendant. Gerald Kellard, is that right?" Kellard looked at him with the expression of someone calculating whether this was a confrontation they needed to have. "Yes. And you are?" "Garrett Osman," he said. "Retired Colonel, United States Army, 41st Special Operations Group." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "The woman you had removed from first class this morning was a former combat medic with 9 years of service in classified field operations. The dog at her side is a decorated military working dog who completed 4 active deployments." Another pause, shorter this time. "And in the last hour, while you were in first class, she kept a man from dying." The cabin had gone very quiet. Several passengers who had been moving toward the exit had stopped. Kellard's expression shifted through several things in rapid succession. His wife looked at the floor. "I wasn't aware," he started. "Of her service," Garrett said. "I know. That's the point." He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. "You made a judgment about who she was based on what she was wearing, and you were wrong. I hope that stays with you." He turned away then, without waiting for a response, and moved back to where Nora was standing with Titan at the edge of the emptying row. She had heard the whole thing. She hadn't asked him to do it, wouldn't have, and she was experiencing a complicated response to having someone say the thing she hadn't let herself say. Not relief, not vindication exactly, more like the odd vertigo of watching something you'd been holding in one hand for a long time get transferred to someone else's. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I wanted to." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card, which he held out to her. "There are people who want to speak with you in Hadley City, tonight, if you're willing, before the ceremony." She didn't take the card immediately. "What people?" she said. "People who have been looking at that incomplete report for 6 years," he said, "and would like to finish it." Nora looked at the card, then at Titan, then at the emptying plane around her, where the overhead bins were hanging open and a flight attendant was collecting the blankets from the seats in first class, and somewhere near the back, another attendant was resetting the tray tables, all of it proceeding in the ordinary rhythm of a flight concluded, everything returning to the configuration it had been in before any of them had boarded. She took the card. Outside the aircraft windows, the clouds had broken while they were taxiing, and Hadley City was visible now. The skyline low and gray-brown in the November light, the kind of city that didn't announce itself. She had been told it was a 3-day trip, transport Titan, attend the ceremony, fly home. She had packed accordingly. She had not packed for whatever Garrett Osman meant by people who have been looking at that incomplete report. She put the card in her jacket pocket, picked up her duffel, and moved toward the exit with Titan at her heel. In the jetway, cool and fluorescent and smelling of recycled air and rubber, she passed 3 airline staff who looked at her with the particular expression of people who had been on their radios and knew more than they were showing. One of them said, "Ms. Voss," in a tone that suggested she was expected. She kept walking. At the end of the jetway, the terminal opened up. The flat noise of a mid-sized airport, the announcements overhead, the crowd moving in its usual patterns of purpose and waiting. She scanned the space automatically, the way she always did in new environments, left to right, exit points, clusters of stillness inside moving crowds. She found the stillness almost immediately. 4 people. Standing near the gate entrance, 2 in civilian clothes, one in a uniform she recognized as Army, and one, the one her eyes went to last and stayed on, in the dress uniform of a rear admiral. She had not expected this. Titan had gone still at her heel, and she felt rather than heard the low sound in his chest, not the alert from the plane, something different. Recognition, maybe. He had been around enough military that the uniforms registered in his memory, too. The admiral was looking at her with an expression that she could not immediately read, not the expectancy of someone waiting for a subordinate, not the formal neutrality of an official ceremony. something more personal than either. He took one step forward. "Corporal Voss," he said, and then corrected himself with the slight pause of someone reaching for the right word. "Miss Voss." Nora stood in the middle of the terminal with her duffel on her shoulder and her dog at her side and the card from Garrett Osman in her pocket, and she was aware suddenly that she had made a wrong assumption somewhere in the last 4 days. She had believed this trip was about Titan's retirement, about Marcus's family, about closure for other people. She had not considered that it might be about something else entirely. "Admiral," she said carefully. "We have a lot to talk about," he said, "and there's something else." He glanced at the two people in civilian clothes beside him, and something passed between them, the kind of glance that preceded information nobody wanted to deliver quickly. "Something that happened this morning, before your flight landed." Her jaw tightened slightly. "What happened?" He met her eyes. "Someone accessed your service record," he said, "the classified version, 3 hours ago. And whoever it was, they didn't stop at reading it." "Someone accessed your service record," he said, "the classified version, 3 hours ago. And whoever it was, they didn't stop at reading it." Nora's first instinct was to ask who. Her second instinct, arriving half a second later, was to not ask it in the middle of a public terminal with 400 people moving past them and no idea what kind of conversation she was about to walk into. "Is there somewhere else we should be having this?" she said. The Admiral, whose name she still didn't have, glanced at the two civilians. The taller one, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped hair and the particular flat composure of someone in federal intelligence work, was already scanning the terminal around them. "Yes, c'est chemise," the Admiral said. "There is." They moved through the terminal in a configuration that Nora recognized, even though she hadn't been in one for 6 years. The subject in the middle, the group arranged around her at just enough distance to not look like an escort, close enough to function as one. Titan walked at her left heel without instruction. He had done this before too. The room they brought her to was past the secure side of the gate area, accessible through a door that required a badge she didn't have, and that the tall civilian woman had. It was a small operations room, the kind airports maintained for situations that weren't supposed to become public situations. A table, 6 chairs, a screen on one wall, and a telecommunications setup that was significantly more sophisticated than anything a regional airport needed for flight operations. The Admiral sat. The two civilians positioned themselves near the screen. A man in Army uniform, a colonel, she noted, full bird, closed the door and stayed near it. Garrett Osman sat at the end of the table and said nothing. "I'm Rear Admiral Dennis Farrow," the Admiral said. "I'm attached to the Joint Personnel Records Office, specifically the division that manages classified service histories." Nora sat. Titan settled under the table. "Okay. I'll get to the record access in a moment. Before that," Farrow set his hands flat on the table, "I want to explain why you're here. The whole of it." She waited. "Titan's retirement ceremony was arranged approximately 7 weeks ago," he said. "Lorraine Whitfield made the initial request. Standard process. Military working dog, handler KIA, family wants proper recognition. We approved it. What was less standard was that Lorraine specifically requested that the dog be transported by you." He watched Nora's face. "She gave your name, your hospital, your address." Nora kept her expression neutral with the practice of someone who'd had reasons to keep it neutral in rooms like this before. "How did she know where I was?" she asked. "She found you," he said simply. "She's been looking for 4 years. She hired a private researcher 18 months ago, and they tracked you through a combination of nursing license and tell us this when she made the request. We found it when we pulled her communications as part of the ceremony preparation." "Why would her communications require pulling?" Farrow looked at the tall civilian woman, who stepped forward. "My name is Agent Sela Moro," the woman said. "Defense Intelligence. We've been monitoring activity around a set of classified personnel files for approximately 8 months. Records connected to operations in a specific geographic region between 8 and 12 years ago." She didn't name the region. She wasn't going to. "In the last 3 hours, someone used a credentialing system that should have been inactive, belonging to a contractor who formally separated from service in 2019 to access a classification 4 file." She turned to the screen. "This one." The screen populated with a document. Nora had enough time to see the header, her own name, her service number, her specialty designation, before Morrow advanced past it to a page that showed access logs, timestamps. A credential ID. The contractor whose ID was used, Morrow said, is a man named Dale Pruitt. He worked logistics and communications support for the same operational theater you served in. He was separated for misconduct. We don't need to get into the specifics. What matters is that someone used his reactivated credentials this morning and that this access was not random. Nora looked at the logs. The access had been at 6:47 a.m. She had been at the airport check-in desk at 6:42. They were watching me board, she said. We believe so. Why? Morrow and Farrow exchanged a look that was too fast to read fully. Garrett was still at the end of the table, watching her. We're going to need to walk through some history, Farrow said, some of which you know, some of which you may not. Nora put her hands on the table. They were steady. They were always steady. Walk me through it. What followed was 40 minutes of information delivered in the careful, layered way of people who had organized difficult material for maximum comprehension and minimum panic. Nora sat still through most of it, asking questions at specific points, not interrupting the structure they'd built because she could see they'd built it deliberately. The short version was this. The operation in which Marcus Whitfield died and Titan was wounded had involved the interception of a communications network used by a non-state paramilitary group operating in a region that multiple governments had official interest in. The operation had been successful in its primary objective. It had been less successful in accounting for all of the individuals connected to that network at the time. 3 people who had been identified in the operation's after-action analysis as peripheral contacts, not principals but connected, had since resurfaced in the United States. 2 were under active surveillance. The third, a man who had worked as a civilian interpreter during the period in question and whose connection to the network had been assessed as low-level at the time, had in the last 8 months demonstrated a pattern of behavior that had upgraded him to active concern. His name, Morrow told her, was Eamon Vreek. Nora didn't know the name. She said so. You wouldn't, Morrow said. He was never in your operational radius, but he was there, and he's been building something, we don't fully know what yet, that appears to involve accessing personnel files of people who were present during that operation. Why? Nora said. We have theories. What we know for certain is that your file was accessed this morning and that Vreek was in Hadley City as of 48 hours ago. The room was quiet for a moment. Nora looked at Garrett. Did you know about this when you were on the plane? About Vreek? No, about the file access. I got a message when we were taxiing in. He held her gaze. I would have told you before we left the plane if I'd known the full picture. She decided she believed him, which didn't completely solve the problem, but at least simplified one part of it. What do you need from me? She said. Right now, nothing operational, Farrow said. We need to establish your movements, ensure your security for the duration of your stay, and... He paused, rearranging something. We need to finish a record. She looked at him. The incomplete after-action from 6 years ago, he said. We need your formal account of what happened during the 4 hours and 11 minutes after Whitfield went down. On record. Authenticated. He put both hands flat again. We should have done this then. We didn't, because the situation was classified in a way that required the personnel involved to be kept separate from any documentation that might be discoverable. That was the call at the time. It was the wrong call, and I'm aware of that. Nora sat with that for a moment. 41 hours of recent sleep debt and a low-grade headache she'd been managing since hour 36. And now this, a room full of people telling her that a version of her life she'd buried was about to be unburied, not by her choice, but because someone else had already started digging. The ceremony is tomorrow, she said. Yes. Lorraine Whitfield is going to be there. Yes. Does she know any of this? The record access, Vreek. No, Farrow said, she doesn't, and we'd like to keep it that way through tomorrow. Nora thought about a woman who had spent 4 years finding her, who had arranged for a retired military dog to be transported by a specific person because she had a specific reason for wanting that to happen. She thought about what that kind of sustained, quiet effort looked like, what it required to maintain. I want to meet her before the ceremony, Nora said. Pharaoh nodded. That can be arranged. The debriefing continued for another 90 minutes. Nora gave her account of the operation in the flat, detailed way that she had given it once before to a Classification 4 review board, and once before that to the field commander who had pulled her out of the site. She had told the story so few times that it hadn't worn smooth the way stories did when people repeated them for comfort or effect. It still had all its rough edges. She felt those edges while she talked, which was unpleasant, and she kept talking anyway. Titan stayed under the table. When she got to the part about Marcus, what she had found when she reached him, what she had done, the sequence of decisions she'd made in the dark with limited supplies, and the sound of intermittent fire still audible somewhere north of her position, he put his head on her foot. She talked through that too. Garrett sat at the end of the table and did not look at the wall or the table. He looked at her. There was something in his face that she had trouble naming until it occurred to her that it was the expression of someone who had spent 6 years imagining a scene based on fragmentary evidence and was finally seeing it clearly for the first time. It wasn't comfortable to have a stranger carry that expression while you talked. It was something she had to just let happen. When she finished, Morrow had 3 pages of notes, and Pharaoh had said thank you in a way that meant something more than the words. The meeting broke up at just past 4 in the afternoon. The colonel who'd been standing at the door said they had a car to take her to the hotel where the ceremony organization had booked her room. Same hotel as Lorraine Whitfield. One more thing, Nora said before they moved. Pharaoh looked at her. The couple on the plane, she said. Kellard? Gerald Kellard. He waited. I don't want anything done about that, she said. Garrett's conversation with him in the cabin was enough. I don't need a formal complaint or a record or an apology from the airline. It's done. Pharaoh nodded slowly. Understood. She wasn't sure she'd made the right call. She wasn't sure it was entirely her call to make, given that Garrett had inserted himself into it. But she was tired of that being the story, and she knew from experience that official processes designed to deliver justice often delivered something that felt much more like prolonged exposure to the incident than like justice. She was tired of the incident. The hotel was 12 minutes from the airport, and she spent those 12 minutes in the back of a government-plated sedan with Titan across her legs and her eyes on the window and her mind going through everything Morrow had told her about Vrak, trying to find the shape of it, what he wanted, what the file access was for, what the geometry of threat looked like in this specific case. She didn't reach a conclusion. There wasn't enough information. She filed it under active and unresolved and moved on to the things she could do something about, which right now were eat, check her messages, and figure out how to handle the next 20 hours without the situation collapsing into something Lorraine Whitfield's family had to be shielded from. The hotel was adequate. Her room had a window facing north and a radiator that worked harder than it needed to, and she stood in the shower for 7 minutes, more than she usually allowed herself, and then sat on the edge of the bed and ate a protein bar from her duffel and looked at the card Garrett had given her on the plane. He had written a number on the back in pen. Below the number, 2 words, call tonight. She looked at it for a while, then set it on the nightstand. Her phone had 4 messages. One from a colleague at Callaway Ridge asking about a patient's chart from her last shift, which she answered. One from the transport program confirming Titan's paperwork was filed. One from a number she didn't recognize, which she did not open. One from Lorraine Whitfield, a text sent at 2:30 p.m. before the plane had landed. I heard you're here. I know this is a lot. I'm in room 214 if you want to talk tonight. No pressure. She read it twice. Then she put on dry clothes, clipped Titan's lead, and went down the hall to room 214. Lorraine Whitfield was smaller than Nora had imagined, which was an irrational thing to notice because she had not spent significant time imagining her. She was in her early 60s, with Marcus's eyes. Nora knew that from the photographs she'd seen Sorte files, or thought she did, or was maybe constructing in retrospect. She opened the door before Nora finished knocking and stood there for a moment just looking at her. He told me you'd be exactly like this, Lorraine said. Nora wasn't sure what this meant. Who told you? Marcus. Before the last deployment. She stepped back from the door. Come in. I made tea, which I know is a strange thing to offer, but I needed to do something with my hands. The room was the same as Nora's in layout. Lorraine had a photograph on the desk. Marcus, in uniform, 20-something, with Titan at his side. The dog was younger in the photograph, his muzzle fully dark, his posture carrying the taut readiness of a working animal in peak condition. Titan saw the photograph from across the room and made a sound Nora had never heard from him before. A single low note, not distress, not alert. Something else. Lorraine looked at him. Her expression broke slightly, not into tears, but into something that was adjacent to them and choosing not to become them. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly. He walked to her, slowly, as though he was giving her time to prepare. He stopped at her feet and looked up, and she put her hand on the top of his head with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. Nora stood near the door and said nothing, because this was not her moment, and she knew it. It lasted about 30 seconds. Then Lorraine straightened and picked up one of the 2 cups of tea she'd prepared and held it out. Marcus said the medic who stayed with Titan was the calmest person he'd ever seen in a bad situation, she said. He radioed it in while they were still extracting. His exact words were, she paused, reaching for the phrasing. "Whoever she is, she belongs in the field. Don't waste her." Nora took the tea. It was too hot. She held it anyway. "He didn't know my name," she said. "No, but I found you anyway." Lorraine said it without apology. "I needed to. I needed Titan to be with someone who would understand what he was." "I'm a nurse," Nora said. "I'm not in the field anymore." "I know that." Lorraine looked at her directly. "You're still the person he waited for." Nora didn't have a response that was adequate to that, so she said nothing and drank the too hot tea and sat with it. They talked for an hour. Not about the operation. Nora wasn't going to walk that into this room. Not tonight. Not with this woman. But about Marcus. About who he was when he was 12 and who he became when he was 22, and the particular way that people who grew up to do dangerous things were sometimes the most careful people in the world in their ordinary lives. About Titan's career, which had been distinguished by the standards of any working dog program. About what the ceremony tomorrow was supposed to mean. "Closure," Lorraine said, and then made a face at the word. "I hate that word. It sounds like something closing that was open. I don't want Marcus to be closed." She set down her cup. "I just want him to be remembered correctly, and I want Titan to be... I want him to be okay." She looked at the Malinois, who had settled at Nora's feet at some point in the conversation. "He wasn't okay for a long time." "He's better," Nora said. "I can see that." There was a knock at the door at 9:15 that changed everything. It was Morrow. She was still in the same clothes she'd had on at the airport, which meant she hadn't gone to a hotel yet, which meant something had kept her working. Her expression was neutral in the specific way that meant it was working to be neutral. "Ms. Voss," she said, "I need 5 minutes." Nora excused herself. Lorraine nodded and didn't ask. In the hallway, Morrow pulled the door closed and said quietly, "Vriek is in the building." Nora stilled. "One of our surveillance units tracked him to this hotel 40 minutes ago. He checked in under a different name. We have him on camera. He's on the 3rd floor." Morrow's voice was controlled, but there was something tight underneath it. "We don't believe he's aware of our presence here, but we're still working to confirm what he knows about yours." "What do you need me to do?" "For right now, stay in your room. We have coverage on the floor. The colonel is on site." She paused. "What I'm about to tell you is not a request, but I want to frame it as information. Vriek is not carrying any of this alone. When we pulled the access logs from this morning, we found a second set of credentials used within 17 minutes of the first. A different contractor ID, someone else was reading your file at the same time, from a different access point. We're still identifying that user." Nora processed this. 2 people. At minimum. "So this isn't a single disgruntled person with a grievance." "No," Morrow said. "It's not." Titan had come to stand beside Nora in the hallway. She hadn't called him. He'd simply appeared when she stepped out, which meant he'd been tracking her from inside the room through the door gap. Old habit, old training, never fully turned off. "What's in my file?" Nora said carefully. "That's worth this kind of effort?" Morrow looked at her. Not like she was deciding whether to answer, like she was deciding how. Your file documents the specific communications intercept that led to the operation, the sources, the methodology, names of assets that were at the time still active in the region. She held Nora's gaze. Some of those assets are still active. The hallway was quiet. The radiator at the far end ticked. If Vreek gets what's in that file, Nora said. People die, Morrow said simply. Not hypothetically. Specifically. Nora looked at Titan. He was looking back at her with those steady eyes that had not blinked once since she'd stepped into the hallway, as if he was waiting for her to arrive at whatever decision she was going to arrive at and was prepared to go wherever it took them. She thought about the retirement ceremony tomorrow, about Lorraine in room 214 with her tea and her photograph and the word closure that she hated, about Harold Beam on the plane, pressing his hand flat against his sternum and trying not to show how scared he was, about Gerald Kellard's face in the aisle of the jetway when Garrett said the words that Nora hadn't said. She thought about 9 years of staying when it was easier to leave. What's the security posture right now? She said. Morrow blinked. Something shifted in her expression, the flat federal composure making room briefly for something that might have been surprise. We have 4 personnel in the building, 2 on Vreek's floor, 1 at each exit. The colonel is in the operations center we set up in. How many access points does this building have? Morrow paused. 6 usable. 2 service entrances, a parking structure connection, the main lobby, a fire exit on the east side, and a loading dock on the north. You have 4 personnel for 6 access points and a target who may have a partner whose location you don't know. Morrow's jaw shifted slightly. We're working on getting additional coverage. I can help, Nora said. The silence in the hallway lasted about 4 seconds. Ms. Voss, Morrow said, you're a civilian. I'm a civilian with 9 years of Classification 4 field experience, a security clearance that hasn't been formally revoked, and the only non-federal person in this building who knows what Vreek's file access means if he completes it. She kept her voice level. I'm not asking to run an operation. I'm saying you're short on personnel, and I know how to hold a position. Another pause, shorter this time. I need to make a call, Morrow said. Make it. Morrow pulled out her phone and stepped 6 feet down the hallway. Her voice was low and quick, and Nora caught the shape of the conversation without the words. Someone on the other end pushing back, Morrow holding the position, a third exchange that resolved in Morrow's direction. She walked back. The colonel wants to meet with you, now. Okay? You're not cleared for direct contact with Vreek under any circumstances. You understand that? Yes. And if this goes wrong, then it goes wrong, Nora said. But it's less likely to go wrong with me awake than with me sitting in my room. Morrow looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Titan, who had not moved. The colonel's in 318, she said. They moved down the hallway. Nora's heartbeat was the same as it always was in these moments. Steady, a little elevated, nothing dramatic. Her mind had already begun the familiar shift into a different mode of attention, the kind that her body remembered even when the rest of her would have preferred to forget. The elevator opened on the 3rd floor, and Nora stepped out, Titan at her heel, and she was 3 steps toward room 318 when Titan stopped. She stopped with him, automatically, without question. He was facing a door 12 feet to their left. Room 309. His body had gone into the flat, locked stillness of a dog that has found something and is holding the alert. Nora looked at Morrow. Morrow looked at the door. Her radio was in her hand before she'd finished turning, and she was already pulling Nora back with her other hand and saying something low into the radio, but the door to room 309 was already opening, and the man stepping through it had a phone to his ear, and when he saw them, he stopped, and in the half-second of stillness that followed, Nora saw his face go through 3 things very fast. Surprise, recognition, and the decision of someone who had been trained to make fast decisions in exactly this situation. He looked at Titan, and Titan looked at him. And in the dog's low chest, for the second time today, that sound began. The one that Nora had heard exactly 3 times in her life, in 3 situations where something was about to go dangerously wrong. The man took one step backward, back toward his door, and his hand moved to the inside of his jacket. The man's hand was still moving toward the inside of his jacket when Morrow's voice cut through the hallway. "Federal agent, hands where I can see them, now." She had her credentials out and her other hand on her sidearm, not drawn but available, and she had moved without hesitation into the geometry of the hallway that put her between the man and the elevator. Nora had moved the other direction, not away from the man but to the left side of the hallway, out of Morrow's line, creating a second angle of observation that was also a second problem for anyone trying to manage the situation in their favor. The man stopped. His hand was still inside the jacket, not yet on whatever was there. Deciding. Titan's alert had not changed. He was standing in the fixed stillness of a dog that had done this before and knew what it was, and the sound in his chest was low and continuous, and in the particular frequency that made every person in the hallway aware of it without being able to explain why. "Slowly," Morrow said, both hands out. "I'm not going to ask twice." 3 seconds? 4. Then the man brought both hands out, empty, and held them at shoulder height. Nora exhaled through her nose. The man was in his 40s, medium build, wearing a collared shirt and unremarkable dark pants. He looked, at first glance, like someone attending a business conference. His face was controlled in the way that people with training controlled their faces. Not calm, exactly, but organized. He was assessing the hallway the same way Nora had assessed it 30 seconds ago. She could see him doing it. "Eamon Vreek," Morrow said. The man said nothing. "I need you to step away from the door and keep your hands visible." He stepped forward. His eyes moved to Titan, then to Nora, and stayed there. "I know who you are," he said. To Nora, not tomorrow. "That's the second time today I've heard that," Nora said. "It's getting less impressive." Something moved through his expression. Not amusement, more like recalibration, the look of someone adjusting a plan. 2 of Morrow's people appeared from the stairwell at the far end of the hallway at a controlled run, no sounds, hands on their weapons. Vreek's visual field narrowed to a corridor of exactly no good options, and he knew it. His shoulders dropped a fraction. Not defeat, but the very specific acknowledgement of a person who has decided to stop spending energy on the immediate situation and start working the longer game. He let them take him. What came next had the organized procedural quality that Nora associated with federal operations when they actually worked as designed, which was not always, but when it was, there was a particular mechanical efficiency to it that she found almost restful compared to the chaos it replaced. Vreek was moved to a room on the same floor that had been cleared for exactly this purpose. The second unknown credential user was identified within 40 minutes, a woman named Harriet Souza, who had been in contact with Vreek through an encrypted messaging chain and had accessed Nora's file from a laptop in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the airport. She was located and detained before midnight. They had moved fast because they'd already known about the coffee shop. They had been watching Souza for 6 of the 8 months they'd been watching Vreek, and the file access that morning had given them the legal threshold they needed. Nora learned this from the colonel. His name was Treadwell, she found out, Raymond Treadwell. In the operations room they'd set up in 318, while Morrow was down the hall beginning the initial interview with Vreek, and Titan was drinking water from a bowl someone had found. "You said you were still identifying the second user," Nora said to Treadwell, when Morrow briefed me in the hallway. Treadwell had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "We had a strong lead. We weren't certain." "You were using me as bait." He didn't answer, which was the answer. She considered being angry about it. She found, when she reached for the anger, that it wasn't quite there, just a dry, tired recognition. This was how these things worked. She had been in enough operational situations to know that information provided to a civilian was never the same as information available. She had understood that when Morrow briefed her. She'd understood it and walked toward room 318 anyway, because the alternative was sitting in her room while people with less situational knowledge of the building tried to manage a fluid situation with inadequate coverage. "The ceremony is still tomorrow," she said. "Yes." Lorraine Whitfield still doesn't need to know about any of this. "That's the current plan." She looked at Treadwell. He was in his mid-50s, careful, with the air of someone who was extremely good at his job, and found that being extremely good at his job required him to make decisions he didn't always enjoy. She had worked under people like that. She respected it even when it was inconvenient. "I want to be in the room when they interview Vrak," she said. Treadwell said nothing for a moment. "That's not standard." "I know. You're a civilian. You said that." Morrow said it too. She looked at him steadily. "I'm also the person whose file was accessed, which means I have a legal interest in the contents of that interview, and I'm the only person in this building who was present during the operation that file documents. If something comes up that requires operational context, you want me available." Treadwell looked at the table, then at her. "Observation room. You don't speak. You don't enter the interview space." "Fine." She was in the observation room at 11:40 p.m., standing behind glass with a cup of bad coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, watching Morrow sit across a small table from Eamon Vreek with the particular patience of someone who had done this many times and had no investment in how long it took. Vreek had asked for a lawyer. He had been informed that a lawyer had been contacted and would arrive in the morning, and that nothing he said before that arrival would be used against him in any proceeding, and that the people talking to him tonight were specifically interested in things that were not going to court, at least not in the venue he was imagining. He processed this for a while. Then he started talking. He talked because people like Vreek, in Nora's experience, did not stay silent easily when they believed they were more intelligent than the people questioning them, and Morrow had a specific skill for creating that impression. She asked questions that were just slightly too simple. She wrote things down by hand, slowly, which made her look like she was behind. She expressed mild confusion at points that were not actually confusing, and Vrak, who had organized a sophisticated operation involving reactivated contractor credentials and a secondary access point, and what turned out to be a carefully constructed 6-month approach to personnel files from a specific classified period, could not quite stop himself from wanting her to understand how clever it had been. The story he told over the next 90 minutes was more complicated than Nora had expected, and also simpler in the part that mattered. He was not working for the paramilitary network. He had never been affiliated with them ideologically. His connection during the operational period had been financial and coerced, and he had resented it bitterly for years. What he wanted from the classified files was not information to pass along. What he wanted was the names of the people who had run the operation so that he could build a case for his own legal exoneration, a documentation that he had been coerced, that his cooperation had been involuntary, that the people who had leveraged him deserved more scrutiny than he did. He had gone about this in the most self-destructively complicated way possible, which included accessing classified materials illegally, involving a second person, and spending 8 months building a surveillance picture of people who were already under federal surveillance. None of this made what he'd done legal. None of it made the risk to the assets named in Nora's file acceptable, but it changed the shape of the thing considerably. He was not a threat in the way Nora had spent the last 4 hours preparing for. He was a desperate man who had made a cascading series of bad decisions because he was trying to fix something that had been done to him a long time ago and could not figure out how to do it through legitimate channels. She stood behind the glass and drank the cold coffee and thought about that. She thought about it for a long time. At 1 a.m, she went to bed. Titan settled on the floor beside her, one ear forward, in the posture she recognized as light watch. Not sleeping, not fully alert, holding the middle ground. She lay in the dark with the radiator ticking and the sounds of the corridor occasionally reaching under the door, and she thought about all the versions of a story that could exist simultaneously without any of them being wrong. Vreek was a threat and a victim of something that had happened in the same mountain corridor where Marcus Whitfield died, and Titan bled out, and Nora spent 4 hours making decisions she hadn't been cleared to make and doing things she hadn't been assigned to do. All of that was true at once. It didn't resolve neatly. It wasn't supposed to. She slept for 5 hours. It was more than she'd expected. The morning of the ceremony arrived gray and cold, the November sky over Hadley City the same flat color it had been since they'd landed. Nora dressed carefully. Not in uniform, she didn't have one, but she had packed one set of clothes that was not a gray shirt and worn jeans. Black pants, a dark blue top that didn't wrinkle badly, boots that were polished mostly from habit. She looked at herself in the mirror for about 3 seconds and decided this was fine. Garrett Osman was waiting in the lobby at 8:30 with 2 cups of coffee that were considerably better than anything the hotel had produced the night before. "From the place across the street," he said. "The hotel stuff is a crime." "It really is." She took the cup. "You know what happened last night?" "Treadwell called me at 2 a.m. He said it without complaint." "Are you all right?" "Yes." She thought about it for another second. "Mostly. I keep getting surprised by how complicated things are, which is strange because I've been alive long enough to know that things are always complicated." Garrett drank his coffee. "Vreek's being processed this morning. Sousa's already been transferred. You'll probably be asked to give another statement at some point, a written one, for the file access incident." "I know." "The ceremony is at 10. "I know that too." They stood in the lobby for a moment, 2 people drinking good coffee in a mediocre hotel, while a government operation was being concluded somewhere upstairs, and a retired military dog was eating breakfast from a bowl on the floor, and a grieving mother was getting dressed in room 214 to say goodbye to her son in the only way that remained available. "Marcus sent me a letter," Garrett said, "before the last deployment. Not the ID tag, separately. A letter." He was looking at the lobby entrance, not at her. He talked about Titan, about the kind of partnership they had. And he said if anything happened to him, he didn't want Titan to spend the rest of his life on the edge of whatever room he was in, waiting. He paused. He said he hoped the medic who worked the field with them would find his way to Titan eventually. Nora looked at him. "He said his way. He didn't know you were a woman. He never saw you. You worked in the dark, and you were gone before extraction. He just knew someone had stayed." Garrett finally looked at her. He knew someone had stayed with his dog when they didn't have to. She didn't respond for a moment. "He was a good soldier," she said, which was inadequate but true. "He was a good person," Garrett said, which was different and also true. The ceremony was held in a wood-paneled hall in a veterans building 6 blocks from the hotel. It was not a large space. The audience was maybe 40 people, military personnel, some in dress uniform, some in civilian clothes, family members, a photographer from a base publication. There were folding chairs arranged in even rows and a small podium and 2 flags at the front of the room. Lorraine Whitfield sat in the front row with a younger man who had Marcus's same jaw, a brother, Nora guessed, and an older woman who might have been an aunt. She was wearing a dark green dress, and her hair was pinned back, and she looked like someone who had decided very carefully how she was going to hold herself today and was holding it. Nora sat at the back. She had intended to sit at the back. This was not her ceremony, and she was not here to take up space in it. Titan sat at her heel. Rear Admiral Farrow spoke first. He talked about the military working dog program with the genuine knowledgeability of someone who had worked alongside it for 30 years. And he talked about Titan's service specifically in terms that were careful about what they included and what they omitted. The classified operations stayed classified, but the shape of the service was clear. 4 deployments. Hundreds of hours of work. A handler who had loved him and done right by him until he couldn't anymore. A formal certificate was presented. Titan's service record printed and bound. A medal, because there was a specific medal for military working dogs who had met a certain threshold of service, and Titan had met it by his 2nd deployment. Lorraine came to the front of the room to receive these things on Marcus's behalf. She was composed in the way that Nora recognized as the product of practice rather than absence of feeling, the kind of composure that you built deliberately because you knew you would need it, and you built it anyway, and it served you, mostly, and cost you something privately. She took the certificate and the medal, and she held them against her chest for a moment, and then she turned to the room. "I want to say something that isn't in the program," she said. A few people shifted. Farrow, at the side of the room, showed no surprise. "Marcus used to call me after deployments," Lorraine said. "He couldn't tell me where he'd been or what he'd done, but he always told me about Titan, every time, because Titan was the one thing he could talk about." She looked down at the certificate in her hands. "After Marcus died, I couldn't find out what had happened. Not the details. I knew I wasn't going to get those, but I couldn't find out what had happened to his dog. Whether Titan had made it. whether someone had stayed with him. She paused. It took me 4 years to find that out. The room was very quiet. The person who stayed was a combat medic, who was there when she didn't have to be, who held that dog alive for 4 hours in conditions that I will never fully understand, and who then went home and went back to being a nurse and never told anyone. Lorraine looked up, and her eyes found Nora at the back of the room. She's here today. She came to bring Titan home. Nora felt the room turn, not dramatically, just the quiet shift of 40 people's attention redirecting. She sat still. She was good at sitting still. Her name is Nora Voss, Lorraine said, and I need her to know that Marcus would have wanted her here, and that Titan waited for her, specifically, for 6 years, because that's the kind of person she is, the kind worth waiting for. It was not a comfortable thing being looked at by 40 people, some of them in uniform, some of them with the particular expressions of military people encountering a name that connected to something they'd heard fragments of over the years. It was not comfortable, and Nora did not perform comfort. She sat with it. She let it be real. She did not look at the floor or the ceiling. She looked at Lorraine. After a moment, she nodded. Once. Lorraine nodded back. Something passed between them that didn't require words and would not have improved with them. The ceremony continued. Afterward, there was coffee and there were conversations, and Nora stood near the back of the room and talked to the people who came to her, 2 soldiers who had known Marcus tangentially, a dog handler who had worked with Titan for 6 weeks during a transition period and wanted to say that the dog had been exceptional, Garrett, who shook her hand without making a speech about it. Pharaoh approached at the end when the room had mostly cleared. There's something else, he said. She looked at him. The record is being completed, he said. The after action from 6 years ago. Your account from yesterday has been incorporated. Your designation is being formally added, your name, your actions, the timeline. He paused. There's a commendation attached. It was recommended at the time by the field commander and then held because of the classification issues. It's being processed now. Nora looked across the room where Lorraine was talking to her son and holding the medal. I don't need a commendation, she said. I know, Pharaoh said. You're getting one anyway. She was going to say something else. She had a response ready, something measured and deflecting, when Treadwell appeared at Pharaoh's shoulder and said something low that she couldn't hear. Pharaoh's expression shifted. What? Nora said. Pharaoh looked at her with the specific expression of someone who was about to deliver information they had not anticipated having to deliver. Vreek's interview this morning, he said. The continuation from last night. He provided additional details about how he identified you as a person connected to the operation. He glanced at Treadwell, then back. He had help. Not Sousa. Someone else. Someone who has been feeding him information about personnel from the classified operational period for approximately 14 months. Someone inside, Nora said. Someone with access to the personnel system, Pharaoh said. He said it carefully, which meant the distinction mattered. Not necessarily active service. Could be a contractor, could be an attached civilian. We're still narrowing the field. Nora thought about this. How many people were named in what he received? 7 individuals connected to the operation, Treadwell said. You were third on the list. Who was first? Treadwell looked at Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, Garrett Osman. The room was mostly empty now. Lorraine and her son were near the door. The photographer was packing up. A soldier was folding the flags with the methodical care that the task required. Nora looked across the hall to where Garrett was standing near the back wall, drinking the last of his coffee, looking at the space with the expression of someone who was finished with the official part of the day and was moving mentally toward whatever came next. She thought about a man who had carried an ID tag until the chain wore through and then replaced the chain and kept carrying it. She thought about a letter written before a deployment to a commanding officer who had no obligation to receive it, but had kept it, and had been on this flight, which she had been told was a coincidence, and which she now was not certain was a coincidence. She thought about Titan, 6 years ago, and who else had known where he was. Has anyone talked to Garrett about this? She said. Treadwell said, Not yet. She looked at Pharaoh. He was on the plane. Yes. Was that coincidence? The pause before Pharaoh's answer lasted exactly long enough to change the temperature of the room. We don't know, he said. Nora set down her coffee cup on the nearest folding chair because she was going to need her hands. Across the room, Garrett turned. He had felt the shift in the space the way people who had spent years in operational environments felt shifts, not through any individual signal, but through the aggregate of 3 or 4 small things that didn't quite add up. His eyes found Nora. He read her expression in about 2 seconds. His own expression changed. Not guilt. She looked for guilt first, the way she always did, and it wasn't there. Something else. Something that looked more like a man who had been waiting for a particular question to arrive and had just watched it walk through the door. He crossed the room toward her. Lorraine and her son moved through the exit behind him. The photographer was gone. The flag soldier finished his work and left. The room was down to Garrett, Nora, Pharaoh, Treadwell, Titan, and whatever Garrett was about to say. I know what you're thinking, Garrett said. Tell me why I'm wrong, Nora said. He stopped about 6 feet from her, close enough to talk, far enough that the space between them felt deliberate. I was on the plane because I asked to be, he said. I found out you were transporting Titan when I contacted the transport program 3 weeks ago to check on the ceremony arrangements. I requested to be on the same flight. That part's true. He looked at Pharaoh, then back at Nora. But I want to know why my name was first on Vreek's list, because I didn't know about the list until 30 seconds ago. Treadwell said, Where were you 14 months ago, Colonel? Garrett looked at him. Retired. 12 months into it. Living in Prescott, working with a veterans transition nonprofit. He said it flatly. I can provide documentation for every day of the last 14 months, and I will, if that's what you need. What we need, Pharaoh said, is to understand how your name ended up at the top of that list. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Because I was Marcus's CO, he said. Anyone researching the operational period from the outside would identify me as the senior most accessible person connected to it. I wasn't deep covered the way the field operatives were. My name was findable. He looked at Nora. Yours was harder. You were well buried. Someone who knew the personnel system would have needed time to get to you. 14 months, Nora said. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without shifting. His hands were at his sides, relaxed, open. The body language of someone who had nothing in his pockets and knew it. She had trusted him on the plane. She had not decided to trust him. It had been a situational assessment based on a specific set of behaviors, and it had held. She was now being asked to reevaluate. She reevaluated. She thought about the ID tag, worn smooth from handling. She thought about the way he'd positioned himself next to Harold on the plane, not to be seen doing something good, but simply because someone needed to be there and he was available. She thought about the jetway and what he'd said to Kellard, and the fact that he hadn't waited to see how Nora responded before saying it. People could fake a lot of things. They could not, in her experience, consistently fake the specific quality of attention that Garrett had directed at Titan from the moment they'd boarded, the kind that came from knowing what the dog meant, not from performing that knowledge. The person feeding Vreek information, she said to Treadwell. What's the access profile? What level of system do they need to be in? Treadwell said, Personnel Administration, Classification 3 or above. So, not a field operative. No, this is someone in a records or administrative role. Someone with regular, legitimate access who's been using it selectively. Nora looked at Pharaoh. Have you pulled the access logs for the 14 months in question? We're pulling them now, Pharaoh said. It's going to take time. There are thousands of access events across that period. I know what to look for, she said. Pharaoh looked at her. The way they access the file, she said. Vreek and Souza used reactivated contractor credentials because they didn't have legitimate access. But the person feeding Vreek had legitimate access, which means they had to mask what they were doing within normal access patterns. There's a specific way to do that. You pull files adjacent to the one you want, you spend time in them, you access the target file briefly and bury it in a sequence. It looks like a routine audit. She paused. I've seen it done. I've done it in the field to assess whether records had been accessed by outside parties. She looked at Treadwell. If you're looking for a needle, I can tell you what the needle looks like. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the silence of uncertainty, but of a group of people realizing that the civilian they'd been cautiously managing had just offered them something they actually needed. Pharaoh said, "How long would it take you?" "Depends on how many records we're filtering. If you can limit it to the specific operational file cluster, maybe 6 hours. Could be less." Treadwell looked at Pharaoh. Pharaoh looked at Garrett. Garrett was looking at Nora with an expression she had now seen twice, the one where he revised his assessment of her upward. "There's a room in the federal building 4 blocks from here," Pharaoh said. "Secure. You'd have access to the log system with DI oversight." "That's fine." "This isn't an official consulting arrangement. There's no—" "I know," she said. "I'm not doing it for the arrangement." He looked at her steadily. "Then what are you doing it for?" Nora looked across the empty chairs and the closed door and the space where Lorraine Whitfield had stood an hour ago, holding her son's commendation against her chest. "There are people in that file whose names Vreek was trying to get," she said. "Active people. I was in the field with some of them. I'm not going to let someone find them through a back door because I wasn't willing to spend 6 hours looking at access logs." Nobody said anything. "Okay," Garrett said, quietly. Not to Pharaoh, not to Treadwell. To her. "Okay." They moved to the federal building in 2 vehicles. Treadwell coordinated the access. The log files came up on a secure terminal in a room with no windows and adequate lighting and a coffee maker that was, mercifully, functional. Nora sat down. Titan settled under the desk. She pulled the first log and began to work. It took 4 hours and 20 minutes, not 6. She found the pattern in the second hour, the specific sequence of adjacent file access that functioned as camouflage, the brief dip into the target records, the careful return to innocuous documents. Once she had the pattern, she could trace it backward and forward through the 14 months, and by the third hour, she had a list of 17 specific events that bore the same signature. By the fourth hour, she had something better. The access events had been conducted on 3 different terminals. 2 of them were in the main personnel records building in the Capitol. One was in a satellite office. The satellite office was attached to the Veterans Transition nonprofit in Prescott, Arizona, the same nonprofit where Garrett Osman had been working for the last 12 months. Nora sat with that for about 15 seconds. She felt the shape of it, the terrible, clean geometry of it. The way a person she had begun to trust was now connected to the source of a leak that had exposed 7 people, including herself, to a man who had spent 14 months building toward something that could have gotten those people killed. She did not want it to be true. She noticed that she did not want it to be true, and she held that noticing at arm's length because wanting something to not be true was not evidence. She printed the log summary. She stood up. She walked to the door of the room and opened it. Garrett was in the corridor outside, sitting in a chair with his forearms on his knees, waiting. He looked up when the door opened, the way he'd looked up at things throughout this entire experience, directly, without preparation, as if he'd decided somewhere along the line that he would look at whatever arrived. She held out the printout. He took it. He read it. She watched his face. What happened there was not the expression of a man encountering evidence of something he already knew. It was the expression of a man who had just seen something he recognized but had not understood until this moment. His jaw set. His eyes moved through the document with the speed of someone reading a map they'd been given too late. "The nonprofit," he said. "Yes. I didn't—" He stopped, restarted. "There's a man named Pell. He runs the administrative side. He has access to the connected federal systems because the nonprofit has a veteran services contract that requires it." He looked up from the printout. "I've been in that office twice in 14 months. He runs it. I run the transition programs." "His name," she said. "Warren Pell." She turned back into the room. Treadwell was already looking at her. "Warren Pell," she said. "Check him against the operational period. Check his contractor history." Treadwell was on his phone before she finished the sentence. The answer came back in 11 minutes. Warren Pell had worked as an administrative contractor for a logistics firm that had provided support services during the operational period. He had never been inside the classified operation. He had been in the region during the relevant years processing supply requests handling documentation for civilian contractors, the invisible administrative layer that supported every large operation and was almost never scrutinized afterward. He had access to names, not through classified channels, through the ordinary administrative detritus of a large operation, rosters, transport requests, housing assignments, medical support logs. All of it unclassified. All of it, if you knew what you were looking at and spent 14 months cross-referencing, enough to build a map. And he had access, through the nonprofit's federal service contract, to personnel records that should have required a higher clearance than the contract provided. An oversight in the contracting language, the kind that existed in hundreds of government vendor arrangements and was exploited in almost none of them until it was. Treadwell was already making calls. Farrow had appeared. The room had acquired the particular velocity of a federal operation in the final stages of becoming something real. Nora sat back down at the terminal and looked at the logs she'd spent 4 hours analyzing, and she thought about a man who had processed supply requests while soldiers and dogs and medics did things he would never fully understand, and who had spent 14 months using a contract loophole and an administrative record set to try to surface what he believed were the names of people who were responsible for something she didn't yet know he thought they were responsible for. She pulled up the nonprofit's public records, its founding documents, its stated mission. Then she pulled up the name of the contractor firm that Pell had worked for during the operational period. The firm's contract's public record included a civilian interpreter services agreement. She looked at the name on the agreement, Eamon Vreek. She sat completely still. Vreek had said he'd been coerced, that his cooperation with the network had been involuntary, that he wanted the names of the people who had run the operation so he could document his coercion. And Nora had spent the previous night deciding that this was probably true, that he was a desperate man rather than a dangerous one. What she had not considered was who else knew about the coercion, who else had a grievance that lined up with Vreek's, who had been close enough to see it happen, who had spent 14 months not trying to expose anyone, but trying to find the specific people he believed had failed to protect a civilian interpreter from being leveraged by a network that should have been identified sooner. Pell wasn't working for Vreek. Pell was working for a version of justice that looked, from the outside, exactly like the kind of threat that Nora and Morrow and Farrow and Treadwell had spent the last 24 hours responding to as though it were an enemy operation. She printed this record too. She walked back to the door. Treadwell was in the corridor now, on his phone, and Farrow was beside him, and Garrett was still in his chair. She held out the second printout. "Before you arrest Warren Pell," she said, "you need to read this." Farrow took the paper. "Read it." His face went through the same sequence Garrett's had. Recognition, then adjustment, then something that looked like a man being handed a considerably more complicated problem than the one he thought he'd been solving. He looked at her. "If this is what it looks like, I think it's what it looks like," she said. "Then we've spent 24 hours treating a whistleblower like an intelligence threat." "I think that's possible," she said carefully. "I'm not saying Pell's methods were acceptable or legal. I'm saying the picture is different than what we had this morning." She held his gaze. "And before you close the file on any of this, you should know exactly what picture you're working with." Farrow stood in the corridor of a federal building in Hadley City at 4:30 in the afternoon, holding a printout that had just restructured the last 24 hours of an operation he had authorized, and he looked like a man who was very tired and very aware that tired wasn't a condition that changed the requirements of the job. He lowered the paper. "I need to make some calls," he said. "I know," Nora said. She went back into the room and sat down and put her head in her hands for about 30 seconds, which was all she was going to allow herself. And then she sat up and looked at the terminal and asked herself what else she hadn't seen yet. Titan put his head on her knee. She left her hand on his head and thought about Vreek's face in the hallway when he'd looked at her. Not the calculation that had come after, the first expression, the one before he'd had time to organize it. She had read it as recognition. She had been right about that. But she had read it as the recognition of a target or a threat. She thought now that it might have been something else. The recognition of a person he'd been told to find, in a context he hadn't expected to find her, by someone who had told him that this particular person might understand why he'd done what he'd done. Her phone was on the desk beside the terminal. She picked it up and scrolled to a number she hadn't dialed before. The number Pharaoh had given her at the airport yesterday, before any of the rest of this had started. She dialed. He answered on the second ring. "Admiral," she said, "I need you to arrange something." He waited. "I need 10 minutes with Vreek," she said. "Before you finalize anything, just 10 minutes. The pause on the other end was approximately 4 seconds. "Why?" Pharaoh said. Nora looked at the terminal, at the logs, at the map of 14 months of a desperate man's careful work, rendered in timestamps and credential IDs, and the ghost of a connection she still didn't have the complete shape of. "Because I think he knows who inside the personnel system first told him my name," she said. "And I don't think he's going to tell you, but I think he might tell me." Another pause. Longer. "All right," Pharaoh said. "You've got your 10 minutes. The room where they were holding Vreek was smaller than the interview space from the night before. A converted storage room with a folding table and 2 chairs and a ventilation grate that moved air without warming it. He was sitting on the far side of the table when they brought Nora in, and he looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours, which was accurate, and who had spent most of those hours recalculating something, which she suspected was also accurate. Morrow stayed at the door. She had objected to this meeting 3 separate times, and had been overruled each time and had stopped objecting without pretending to agree, which Nora respected. Nora sat down across from Vreek without preamble. He looked at her the same way he had in the hallway, direct, assessing, slightly wrong-footed by her presence in a way he was trying not to show. "You found the logs," he said. "Yes." "And Pell?" "Yes." He nodded once, slowly, as if she had confirmed a thing he'd known was inevitable and had made his peace with. "Then you know I wasn't." "I know what you were trying to do," she said. "I'm not here about that." She put her hands on the table, flat. "I'm here because there's a piece I don't have. Someone gave Pell a name to start with, your name. Someone who had access to records that Pell couldn't reach yet, before he got the contract access established. Someone pointed him at you first and then at the operation." Vreek was quiet. "That person is still out there," she said, "with whatever access they used to start this. I need to know who it was." He looked at the table, then at her. "Why would I tell you?" "Because you've been trying to fix something for 14 months, and you did it in a way that put people in danger who didn't deserve to be in danger," she said. "Not because you're malicious, because you were angry and scared and the legitimate channels weren't working and Pell found you at the right moment." She held his gaze. "I understand that sequence. I've seen it before. But the person who set it in motion, whoever pointed Pell at you, they had a reason, and it wasn't yours. You were useful to them. That's different from being helped by them." Something shifted in his face. "He said his name was Davar," Vreek said. "I don't know if that's real." "How did he contact you?" "Encrypted message, about 16 months ago. Said he had documentation that could support my case, records showing the coercion, the timeline, the people who were responsible." He paused. "He told me that the operation had people who were still protected, still covered by classification, who had made the decision not to identify me as a coerced asset, even though they knew. He said those people needed to be named." Another pause. "He was right that I'd been coerced. Everything else I never confirmed. I just believed it because I wanted to." "Did he give you anything concrete, any material, any record?" "A partial personnel index, names and codes, no full records. Enough to know the operation was real and that the people listed had been in it." His jaw tightened. "Your name was 3rd on the list he sent. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what Pell was doing with the information beyond what he told me, that he was building a file to force an official review." Nora thought about a partial personnel index. Partial meant someone had built it from fragments, from the same kind of cross-referencing that Pell had done, or from something with slightly better access than a logistics contractor should have. Not classification 4, not full personnel records, something in between. "The name Davar," she said. "Did he ever give you a way to reach him? Or did it always go one direction?" "One direction. Always him to me." "How many messages total?" 4. The last one was 8 months ago. He said he'd given me everything he could and the rest was up to me and Pell. She sat with that. 4 messages, 16 months ago to 8 months ago, and then silence. Someone who had seeded a situation and then stepped back from it. That was a specific operational signature. You didn't step back because you lost interest. You stepped back because your continued presence became a liability, or because you'd already gotten what you needed from the interaction and the rest was other people's problem. He used you, she said. I know that now. What did he get from you? What did you give him in exchange for the personnel index? Vreek was quiet for a long time, long enough that Morrow shifted at the door. I confirmed that the operation had happened, he said finally, and I gave him the name of the field commander. I thought it was information he already had. He asked me to confirm it, and I did. Nora kept her expression still. The field commander's name was not in any public record. It was in the classified after-action report, which Davar, whoever Davar was, had either not yet accessed or had needed human confirmation of for reasons that suggested he didn't fully trust his source material. Vreek had given him confirmation. That confirmation was worth something to someone who was building a case, or building a target list, or building something else that Nora did not yet have the shape of, but that felt in the back of her neck where she kept her threat assessments like it was not finished. She stood up. Thank you, she said. He looked at her. I'm sorry, he said, about your file, about what it could have. I know, she said. She meant it the way she'd meant things throughout this whole trip, not as absolution, just as acknowledgement. What he had done had been reckless, and had put people at risk, and had also come from a real injury and a real desperation, and a system that had failed him specifically and thoroughly. All of that was true. She wasn't going to sort it out for him. That was going to be a longer process involving lawyers and federal review boards and probably years, and she was not going to pretend it resolved neatly in a converted storage room. She walked to the door. Boss, he said. She stopped. The dog, he said. On the plane. That was... He stopped, started again. I read about the handler, in the materials Davar sent, about what happened to him. He met her eyes. I'm glad someone was there. She looked at him for a moment, then she walked out. She gave Pharaoh the name Davar in the corridor and what Vreek had told her about the 4 messages and the personnel index and the confirmation of the field commander's name, and she watched Pharaoh's expression move through the same stages she'd gone through in the room. Recognition, adjustment, the particular kind of cold attention that meant he was now working a larger problem than the one he'd started with. Davar, Treadwell said. That's a name from the region. I know, Nora said. This changes the scope of what we're... I know that too. She looked at him. But it doesn't change what needs to happen here. Pell needs to be dealt with through a process that accounts for the full picture. What he did was illegal, and also what drove him to it was real. Vreek's situation needs a legal review that's actually fair this time. And whoever Davar is, that's a separate investigation that I'm not part of. She said the last part clearly. I'm not part of that investigation. I came here to bring a dog home. I've given you everything I have. Pharaoh looked at her for a long moment. You've given us considerably more than that, he said. She picked up her jacket from the chair where she'd left it 3 hours ago and walked to where Titan was waiting beside Garrett at the end of the corridor, and she said, I need food and 12 hours of sleep in that order. And Garrett said, There's a diner 2 blocks from here. And they walked out of the federal building into the cold November air without waiting for anyone to tell them they could. The diner was the kind that had been in the same location for 40 years and showed it. Laminate countertops, a coffee maker that produced coffee that was not good but was extremely hot, a menu that covered 12 pages without embarrassment. Nora ordered eggs and toast and ate about 2/3 of it before her appetite gave out. Garrett ordered the same thing and finished all of it. Titan was under the table. The waitress had noticed him and not said anything, which Nora filed as evidence that this was a good diner. Davar, Garrett said. Don't, she said. I know, but I can't think about it tonight. It's their problem now, and it's going to stay their problem. She looked at him. Unless it isn't, in which case someone will call me, and I'll deal with it then. He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued at this point as his version of acceptance. The slight forward lean, the hands around the coffee cup, the quality of someone who has decided to trust another person's assessment of their own limits. "What happens to Titan now?" he said. She looked at the Malinois under the table. He was asleep, or close to it. His eyes were at half-mast, and his breathing had the deep, slow rhythm of an animal that had determined the current situation was safe enough to rest in. "I haven't decided," she said. And then, because that wasn't quite honest, "I think he comes home with me." Garrett nodded. He had, she suspected, already known that. "And the nursing?" he said. "I go back Monday." She paused. "I like the nursing." "Even after all this?" "Especially after all this," she said, and she meant it. The ICU at Callaway Ridge, with its short-staffed nights and its difficult families and its patients, who were sometimes impossible and sometimes broke her heart, and sometimes recovered in ways that surprised everyone. That was not a lesser version of a life. It was a different way of doing the same thing she had always done. Staying when it was easier to leave, being useful in the specific way that she was useful to the specific person who needed it right now. She had spent 6 years thinking of that as a retreat. She was revising that assessment. Warren Pell was arrested the following morning. The federal complaint was unsealed the day after, and because complaints of that type occasionally attracted the attention of journalists who covered federal contracting and defense oversight, the story moved in the particular way that stories about systemic failures moved, not fast and dramatic, the way crimes with obvious villains moved, but steady and widening, the way water found its level. It took 10 days to reach the kind of coverage that named names and outlined the contracting oversight failures that had allowed a veteran services nonprofit to maintain federal personnel system access that exceeded its authorized scope. It took 3 weeks for a congressional oversight inquiry to be announced. Warren Pell's attorney released a statement saying his client had acted out of a genuine desire to expose a failure of duty of care to a coerced civilian contractor. The statement was accurate in some respects and incomplete in others, as statements released by attorneys tended to be. Eamon Vriek's case was referred to a legal review panel with the specific mandate of examining whether the original assessment of his status as a voluntary peripheral contact was accurate in light of the materials his records contained. The review panel was not fast. It would not be. But it had been opened, which was different from what it had been before. The field commander, whose name Vriek had confirmed to Davar, was notified. That was not Nora's information to have, but Garrett told her, and she was glad to know. None of this appeared in any publication with Nora's name in it. Her involvement in the record access investigation remained classified. Her name appeared once, in the formal completion of the after-action report from 6 years ago, in the section that documented the actions of personnel during the 4 hours and 11 minutes following Marcus Whitfield's death. It appeared there with her full name, her service number, and a commendation recommendation that Admiral Farrow had signed personally and that the relevant review board approved 3 weeks after she returned to Callaway Ridge. She did not attend any ceremony for the commendation. She requested that the documentation be mailed. The letter from Lorraine Whitfield arrived the same week as the commendation paperwork, which felt like a coincidence, and probably was. Lorraine wrote the way she talked, measured, clear, without performing emotion, and without suppressing it either. She thanked Nora for coming. She said that seeing Titan settled, seeing what settled looked like on him after years of the alternative, had given her something she'd been trying to locate for a long time, and hadn't had a word for. She said Marcus used to say that the most important thing a person could do in a bad situation was just stay. Not fix it, not explain it, not make it better than it was, just stay. And that she thought Nora understood that the way Marcus had understood it. She said she was glad they'd found each other. Nora read the letter twice, at the kitchen table in her apartment in the early morning before her shift, with Titan asleep on the floor 3 feet away, and the coffee going and the pre-dawn quiet of a neighborhood that hadn't fully woken up yet. She folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where she kept things that mattered and that she did not need to look at regularly to know they were there. She was late to her shift by 6 minutes because she had spent 4 of those minutes sitting at the kitchen table not doing anything in particular, just existing in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has recently set it down and is still getting used to the different weight of themselves without it. The shift was hard. They were always hard lately, because the unit was understaffed and the winter census was up, and there were 3 patients on her floor who required the kind of sustained clinical attention that left you at the end of 12 hours, with the particular emptiness of having given everything available in your tank and confirmed the tank was, in fact, bigger than you thought. She drove home at midnight with the heater running and the radio off and Titan in the back seat, and she thought about the things that the last 2 weeks had changed and the things they hadn't. She was still a nurse who worked too many hours. She was still a person who found it easier to stay than to leave. She was still the keeper of 9 years of experience that didn't fit neatly on a resume or explain itself in ordinary conversation. She was still imperfect in all the specific ways she had always been imperfect, impatient with bureaucratic slowness, prone to taking on more than she could reasonably carry, bad at asking for help in situations where asking for help was clearly the correct choice. None of that had changed. What had changed was that there was a formal record now that said she had been there, that said what she had done, that attached her name to a set of events that had previously existed in a classified document with 11 redactions and an empty line where the medic's name should have been. She hadn't known, until the record was complete, how much the incompleteness had cost her. She had thought she didn't care. She had built a life on not caring, on the premise that recognition was for people who needed external confirmation of their own value. And she had told herself this so many times and with such conviction that she had nearly convinced herself it was true. It wasn't quite true. It turned out that there was a difference between not needing to be seen and not being seen. She had conflated them for 6 years as a form of protection. She wasn't sure she regretted the protection. The protection had served its purpose. She had needed the distance, the plainness, the gray shirt, and the worn duffel, and the life that didn't announce itself. She had needed to be ordinary for a while, after years of being required to be extraordinary in conditions that left marks. But she had been ordinary in a way that sometimes crossed into invisible. And invisible was not the same as chosen. Invisible was what happened when you stopped explaining yourself to a world that was going to judge you by the surface anyway, and you let it, and after a while you forgot that you had chosen the silence and started to believe the silence was all there was. Titan had not believed that. He had waited. Not passively. She understood now that she hadn't understood before what his waiting had looked like from the outside. 3 placements. 3 situations where every marker said this dog is fine, this dog is workable, this dog should settle. And he hadn't, not because he was broken, but because he remembered something specific and would not substitute anything else for it. She thought about what that required. To hold a thing with that much fidelity across 6 years, without any confirmation that the thing you were holding was still real. She thought she could learn something from that. She parked in her lot and sat in the car for a moment in the dark, listening to the engine tick down, and then she looked in the rearview mirror at Titan in the back seat, awake now, watching her with the steady patience he had apparently decided to apply to her in perpetuity. "Okay," she said. "Let's go in." He was out of the car before she finished the sentence. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that was cold and clear, in the specific bright way of winter days that looked warmer than they were, Nora Voss walked into Callaway Ridge Medical Center for her shift and nodded to the security guard at the desk, who nodded back and took the elevator to the 4th floor and changed into her scrubs in the locker room and picked up her first chart of the day. The charge nurse, a woman named Delphine, who had worked this floor for 22 years and trusted approximately 4 people on the planet, stopped her in the corridor. "You look different," Delphine said. Nora looked at her. "I got some sleep." Delphine looked unconvinced. She was generally unconvinced by simple explanations. "It's not that. You look like," she considered, "like you know something." "I know a lot of things," Nora said. "I'm a nurse." Delphine made a sound that was halfway between agreement and skepticism and moved on because there were 4 patients to check and a medication reconciliation overdue, and the morning didn't wait for anyone to finish being observant. Nora moved down the corridor with her chart in hand and the familiar weight of a 12-hour shift settling around her like something she knew exactly how to carry, which she did, which was the point. The thing people got wrong about strength, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't announce itself or require an audience, was that they assumed it was the absence of something, the absence of fear or doubt or the need to be seen. They assumed that people who didn't make noise about their own capability had simply eliminated the parts of themselves that required it. That wasn't how it worked. The quiet was not absence. It was a decision, made and remade every day, to let the work speak without insisting on being heard over it. To stay in the room when the room was hard. To trust that what you were was visible to the things that mattered, even when it was invisible to everything else. The dog had known. He had known from a dark mountain corridor where she'd worked in the noise and the cold and the specific terror of someone trying to hold a living thing together with inadequate equipment and no authorization, and nothing but the determination that this was not going to be the moment she stopped trying. He had carried that knowledge for 6 years and had refused to dilute it. She thought that was the most honest thing anyone had ever said about her, and he hadn't used a single word. At noon, she ate a sandwich standing up in the break room and checked her phone and found a message from Garrett. Pell's attorney filed this morning. Case is moving. And below that, after a pause indicated by the timestamp, Titan. Okay? She looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed back, "He's good. Sleeping on my couch," which I told him not to do. 3 dots appeared. Then, did he listen? She smiled, which was not something she did frequently enough, according to most people who knew her. "No," she typed. She put her phone back in her pocket and picked up the next chart and walked back into the corridor, into the particular noise and need of a hospital floor in the middle of a Tuesday, and she did what she had always done, which was exactly what was needed, for as long as it took, without asking whether anyone was watching. She already knew the answer to that, and for the first time in 6 years, it was enough.